Thanks so much for coming. When in St. Petersburg, people said no one will go to a talk about 16th century Florida in Orlando. They had so many other things to do in Orlando, you'll be lucky to get 3 people. And I said, no, the Canadian team played ice hockey last night and won, so there's nothing to keep people occupied today. They will come to this talk. And yes, I come from Western Canada and write about 16th century Florida. And if you had told me as a graduate student that I was going to be a specialist in 16th century Florida, I probably would have said, why? What was in Florida in the 16th century? What was in Florida before air conditioning, let alone in the 16th century? And so today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that path. And I want to thank you. I've spoken all over the state, but this is the first time I've ever spoken in Orlando, which seems so odd, the number of times that I've been here that this is the first time. The last few years have been quite fascinating to be a specialist in early Florida history, in part because of a whole series of anniversaries. The first of which that drew not just statewide attention, but national and international attention was an anniversary that focused around this. And anyone other than Rick who can tell me what you're looking at? Anyone? This is Juan Ponce de Leon's signature. Yeah, that's Juan Ponce de Leon's signature. This is the J and the U, and the little O above it is just shorthand in the 16th century for Juan. And here's a P and O, a C with a cedilla underneath like in French, and the E, and the line above it is simply shorthand indicating that it's replacing the letter N. Then you have a D and an E and an L-E-O with the line above it for Leon. And that's Juan Ponce de Leon's signature. As you know, the governor recently announced that every Florida student should learn how to read 16th century Spanish. So, no, that's a dream I keep having, that the governor announces that it's required. I teach students how to read this, so those students at the back thinking of where they want to go to college, if you come to the University of South Florida, St. Petersburg, you can learn how to read 16th century Spanish handwriting and then come with me to Spain to work in the archive of the Indies, uncovering more Spanish Florida stories. Then, of course, last year, the city of St. Augustine commemorated its 450th. And what better way to commemorate a 450th than have a big cake? And so there was a large cake there, and the following week, these 2 individuals arrived in Florida to also commemorate part of the 450th, and this is their Royal Majesties of Spain, King Felipe VI and Queen Letizia. He's 6'6". I'm almost 6'6". I'm standing behind. It makes me look shorter than... And the funny thing is, he's standing in front of a monument that his ancestor ordered destroyed. And I think it's kind of a forced smile here because I had told him the story. And I said, isn't that cute that your ancestor wanted this destroyed? And the residents of the city of St. Augustine said, we're not taking this down, we like it. And I told him that story, and he said, well, good for the residents of St. Augustine that they decided to keep that obelisk, which was a monument to a 19th century constitution, Spanish constitution. When the anniversary was approaching, the city asked me if I would write the commemoration book for the 450th. And one of the first things that came to mind was an excerpt from a book that I assign my students. It's a wonderful book by a Haitian scholar named Michel Rolfe-Trouillot. And in it, he speaks about historical commemorations, about anniversaries. And he said that anniversaries or commemorations sanitize messy history. For Trouillot and for historians, history is messy. If it's not messy, you're not doing it right. It is messy. It's filled with contradictions and complexities. And anniversaries for Trouillot simplified them. They sanitized them. And that they also contributed to a continuous myth-making process, and they make history more elementary. that you lose the richness and the complexity of it. And that was always a challenge when you think about writing anything. How do you write something for an audience without losing that? And to some extent, we all commit this kind of great crime for Trujillo of simplifying a past. And imagine trying to write, they told me you get 40,000 words to write the entire history of St. Augustine, from before Europeans arrived to yesterday. And had I really known what a struggle that was going to be, I would have said no. And I should have said no when they said, and this is the title of the book. The book will be called St. Augustine, America's First City. Is that statement true? No. St. Augustine is not America's first city. In other words, the title is wrong. And we fought about this, and of course I lost because I was only writing the book. And they said, look, we already have the shirts and the mugs. And I said, if you want to be accurate, St. Augustine is the oldest continuously occupied European settlement in the continental United States. And they said, yeah, that's the worst book title we've ever heard in our lives, and it doesn't fit on a mug or on a t-shirt, and we like oldest city, first city, we win, you lose, write the book and be quiet. And in a sense, that's what we have to deal with in terms of anniversaries, thinking about oldest and first, and most often a first is not a first, and an oldest is not necessarily an oldest. The other challenge is there is a popular perception of Spanish Florida and of St. Augustine in the 16th century. And I think it's beautifully captured in Tony Horowitz's book. And Tony Horowitz wrote of St. Augustine. Horowitz was describing St. Augustine from around the time of Jamestown. And he said, St. Augustine was a precarious outpost beset by mutinies, pirate raids, plague, fires, Indian hostility, and other woes. That's what I wanted to call the book. And I said, this is what the tourist industry should use to draw visitors to St. Augustine, because this is how it was described. And they said, no, we don't like that either. Except they like this. How many times was St. Augustine attacked by pirates in the 16th century? Once. In the 17th century, fewer than 5 times. So sometimes you get the impression that pirates arrived every weekend. It's Sunday, pirates are coming, so we need to have a parade, and it's Talk Like a Pirate Day, dress like a pirate, and there are pirates everywhere. Pirate raids in St. Augustine were rare, few and far between. Now, once you were outside of St. Augustine, and you were on your way to Havana, or Puerto Rico, or somewhere in the Caribbean, or even back to Spain, that was a different story. And pirate raids were, of course, an important matter. The other thing, when you look at these, precarious outposts, not really, not by the time of Jamestown. St. Augustine was a vibrant community by the time of Jamestown. It was not a precarious outpost. Beset by mutinies, no, it wasn't. There were a couple of early unrests in St. Augustine in the immediate years after it was founded. But by this point, there weren't mutinies. Pirate raids, we already talked about. Plague, no. There's no compelling evidence in the documents of plague after plague after plague in St. Augustine. Fires, yes. In fact, the greatest risk in St. Augustine in the 16th century and in the 17th century was fire. People, governors and others, wrote in their correspondence the one thing they feared most was fire. And fires devastated St. Augustine on a couple of occasions. The year 1599, somebody really ought to write a book about St. Augustine in 1599, because not only was there a devastating fire, but there was also a hurricane that flooded the city. And it was really a year of these terrible disasters. And yet the city survived. It persisted, it continued, and it looked like this. This is a map that for those of you who've studied Florida history, have you ever seen this map? This is why there's a challenge in Florida. These are maps that I promise you, if this were a map of a settlement in Virginia or Texas or California, all of you would have seen this map. This is the Hernando de Mestas map. It dates to about 1595, so more than a decade before Jamestown. This is the image of St. Augustine, the wooden fort that dominated the city. Of course, you can't see that now. This location, which the map maker describes, labels as Pine Island, kind of fascinating place, because when you look closely, it was obviously named after this enormous pine tree, and the map says pinillo, pine, right here. But it also has some text below, and this is hidden when you look at the original of this map. It's hard to see. And this says, this is the fort that the Englishmen burned to the ground. And that, of course, is a reference to Francis Drake, the one pirate assault on St. Augustine in the 16th century. This is the reference to the fort. Hasn't been found archaeologically yet, but I'm confident that one day we will find the archaeological remains of that particular fort. And then this magnificent place that the Spanish named Nombre de Dios. It was an indigenous settlement of Timucua. I'm going to use that term Timucua, even though it's a problematic term. But this was the Pueblo de Indios, Nombre de Dios, the Indian town of Nombre de Dios. And I love how the map describes that it was 2,000 paces from the fort. So you could walk your 2,000 paces and get to Nombre de Dios. This was the site of, and here you can use an oldest, the very first Franciscan mission established in the continental United States. And so this idea, I think this popular perception, when we think of Franciscan missions, we often think of California or the Southwest, Texas. But the earliest Franciscan missions, of course, were in Florida and then into Georgia and up into the entire eastern coastline as far north as the Chesapeake Bay, if we include the Jesuits. This community was a community at the time of Jamestown, or shortly before Jamestown, governed by this person. And here we have a letter dated the 20th of February of 1600. So this is 7 years before Jamestown, signed by somebody who signs her name, Dona Maria. It's a woman. Below that is the term cacica, chief. Dona Maria was the Timucua Indian chief of Nombre de Dios. Her handwriting was better than most of the Spaniards living in St. Augustine at that time. If all my documents were hers, wow, would it be a treat to read her documents. And she wrote a number of letters. She was a privileged ally of the Spanish. The Spanish paid her an annual salary. They gave her all kinds of benefits. She used that relationship in many ways to enhance her own political power, and she became one of the most powerful individuals, not just powerful women, not just powerful indigenous women. She was one of the most powerful person, period, in Northeast Florida at the end of the 16th century. And yet we still don't know a great deal about her, despite the fact that we have letters, and Spanish letters write about her. And again, if this signature read Pocahontas, you would see this document probably in every school textbook in the country. And here you have Dona Maria writing letters. Imagine if the Jamestown folks had landed farther south, and they encounter a woman who speaks Spanish, is fluent, can write, is fully literate, speaks multiple languages. It changes that whole Jamestown narrative. And then, of course, here's downtown St. Augustine, the governor's residence, wonderful illustrations here, the church. None of these buildings are visible. So if we drove from here to St. Augustine now, there's nothing I could show you that was on this map. Everything is underground. The next time you're in St. Augustine and you have a pint at A1A Ale House, you're really right in front of the old church from the 16th century. That was the building that was there at the time. The old part of St. Augustine, it's an organic city. People live there. The city has grown over 450 years, and consequently, these sites, these structures haven't survived. The city, of course, at the time was a city with about 500 residents, and by 500 residents, I mean, this was a mixed community from the beginning. There were people of African descent, both free and enslaved. There were free, what we would call, and what they called themselves, free black conquistadors. There were Irishmen, there were Flemish people, there were French, there were English, there were German, there were Portuguese. When we think of Spanish Florida, in some ways it's a very misleading term. St. Augustine and Spanish Florida, from its early days, is a blend of different ethnicities and different languages. If we could miraculously Bill and Ted Excellent Adventure ourselves back to St. Augustine at that time, we would hear multiple languages. You would encounter people of different ethnic backgrounds and different experiences. And of course, church and tavern and gallows and cobbler shops and barracks and a hospital. At the time, there were a handful of missions, missions that ran up the coastline into present-day Georgia and almost to the border with present-day South Carolina. We have Franciscan friars, like this individual here. I wish we had a portrait. This is just an imagined image of what this character looked like in the 16th century. This was a Franciscan friar named Francisco Pareja, who was the longest serving Franciscan friar that I can find in Florida. He served in Florida for almost 30 years, and he learned the Timucua language. And in 1612 in Mexico, he published the very first indigenous language text from any part of the continental United States. And this is 1612, so this is 5 years after Jamestown. And what you have here is the Spanish 10 Commandments. And here are the 10 Commandments in Timucua. And the Lord's Prayer and the Hail Mary and a series of other writings. And he continued to write these accounts with the assistance of his Timucua assistants, who probably it was the Timucua themselves who wrote this part. And he did the Spanish version. So what was St. Augustine like, and why did people continue to come to Florida in an age before Disney, when perhaps it was less fun? There wasn't as much to do, and what brought the Spanish here in the first place? I think it's important to put Menendez's expedition into proper historical context, and that is, for 50 years, the Spanish tried to establish a permanent foothold in Florida. Going back to Ponce de Leon in 1513, of course, he returns in 21, is injured. We think he was shot in the leg. I found an account this past summer that suggested he was shot in the back, but we'll see. He was shot, and the wound festered, and he died. Pedro de Quejo went on an expedition up the east coast of Florida, Georgia, South Carolina. Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón, not a particularly well-known figure, but he established what you might call the first Spanish attempt to establish a permanent colony. And it was a colony that lasted about 10 months. It hasn't been found archaeologically yet. It was probably somewhere around Sapelo Sound, Georgia, is where that first settlement was. And it lasted for about 10 months. Then, of course, Pánfilo de Narváez and Hernando de Soto. Father Luis Cancer was a Jesuit friar whose vision was to establish a utopian community in Florida. Only friars and farmers, no soldiers. It wasn't going to be a military conquest. And he landed in 1549 somewhere around present-day Tampa Bay and was rather quickly clubbed over the head by Tocobaga Indians, while his fellow Dominicans watched from the ship, and the fellow Dominicans said, yeah, Florida is not for Dominicans. And they went to Mexico instead and decided that that was better. Tristan de Luna, of course, established a settlement at Pensacola. Pensacola, of course, is older than St. Augustine. It lasted for 2 years before it was abandoned. And of course, if you've been following the news, archaeologists have identified the site, the archaeological site of that 16th century settlement just a few months ago. That came out in the press. And then finally we get to Pedro Menendez Avilés. And you have to ask yourself, after 50 years, this was a guy who was already incredibly wealthy, he was well connected, and you look at the history, died in Florida, 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 failed expedition, failed. By the time we get to Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón, who inherited from his father, whose dad died in Florida, he gets to the Caribbean with the license to go to Florida to establish a colony, and he gets to the Caribbean and says, ooh, I know the history of this place. I don't think so. I'm not going. So then we get to Menendez. And I often ask my students, when you think about Menendez, and he certainly knew the history of Florida, why would he come here? They know there isn't gold. They know there isn't silver. They know there aren't precious stones of any kind. And the other thing is, he has to pay for this. Why would he do this? In other words, if there were a reality show in the 16th century, would he be in the reality show as one of the dumbest people of 1565, investing in this enterprise? And I think when you look a little bit more closely at the nature of this expedition, we begin to see what the Spaniards were really thinking and what Menendez was thinking in terms of Florida. But let me back up for just a minute and return to our dear friend Juan Ponce de Leon, who occupies a very privileged place in St. Augustine. In fact, his statue in St. Augustine is probably in the most privileged place of any statue, that any statue could be located in St. Augustine, even more privileged than the city's founder, Pedro Menendez de Avilés. And there it stands proudly, pointing. And we're not even sure that Ponce landed anywhere close to this spot. But the statue's there, and he has become intimately interwoven into St. Augustine's history. And it's a fascinating story how that has happened and how it's unfolded. And in many ways, it's focused around this. And of course, what you're looking at is a 16th century painting by Lucas Cranach el Viejo, the Elder. Wonderful 16th century representation of the Fountain of Youth. And you have Ponce de Leon, who is and will continue to be intimately associated with this story of the Fountain of Youth. The problem is Ponce was never, ever, 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 ever looking for the Fountain of Youth. This was a story that was connected to Ponce after his death. There are no original documents, none, not a shred of evidence that even indicates that he knew of this story. And these are stories that circulate in almost every human culture, that there are waters that have restorative qualities, that are healing. You can still, in many countries in Europe, go to the spa and the state will pay for it, so you can drink the spa water because it's good for your bones, your muscles, makes you feel good to sit in this mineral water. Well, that's not unusual, and in the 16th century it wasn't unusual either. But Ponce setting out from Puerto Rico to find the Fountain of Youth, that's a story that was invented by a Spanish chronicler, Gonzalo Fernandez de Oviedo y Valdés. You know, if you have a name like that, whatever you write is going to be true. Because nobody's going to say, well, Gonzalo Fernandez de Oviedo y Valdés said it. Oh, well, okay, then that. And Oviedo was the official royal chronicler. He wrote more than 50 books about the history of the Americas during his life, beginning really in the 1530s. And Ponce, of course, was already dead. He'd been dead for more than a decade. And Oviedo was quite fond of weaving myths into his story, and he was also quite fond of taking pot shots at people he didn't like. And he had close ties with the Columbus family and their heirs. And the reason Ponce de Leon left Puerto Rico was because he had been rather unceremoniously removed as governor of Puerto Rico because the Columbus family launched a case against Ponce and a claim that Puerto Rico belonged to the Columbus family and that they had the right through Christopher Columbus's contract to name governors. And ultimately the council decided in favor of the Columbus family. And Ponce was removed. In exchange for that, he was given a contract to find, discover, explore other islands to the north, in particular an island that the Spanish knew as Bimini. Well, how then does this become part of the popular imagination in the United States? Here you have this 16th century chronicler writing that Ponce was, and this is what he says Ponce was a very credulous character. In other words, he believed everything. He was stupid. And one day he heard this story that he could venture out and he would find this spring, and if he drank the water, that it would cure his impotence. And he believed it, if you can imagine that. And not only did he believe it, but he spent his life and ultimately his fortune on this ridiculous quest to find this fountain. And the chronicler then continues, and if that wasn't bad enough of a dig at Ponce, he then continues and he says, I've seen old men turn into little boys. I've seen it firsthand. And he said, you know what happens? They get old, and old people become senile, and senile people act like little boys. That's what he was saying. And he said that is a natural process. When you get old, you get young. And we all know that, but Ponce was foolish enough to believe it. Well, we know that if you tell a story well and you continue to repeat it enough, it can transition from myth to history. It becomes true. And in the English language, we owe a great deal of debt to a number of these myths to, I think, a writer that you're all familiar with, Washington Irving. And of course, Washington Irving was the individual who created the myth that Columbus set out to prove that the world was not flat. No educated person in the 16th century thought the world was flat. Nobody ever wrote about it, but Washington Irving did. And Washington Irving created that myth, and that myth became so powerful, it ended up in school textbooks. Please tell me it's not still there. The same thing with the Fountain of Youth story. He then, when he wrote about Columbus and he wrote about the early history of the US, he wove that myth into the story, and everybody read Washington Irving, and it became such a great story that by the time we get to the Gilded Age in the US, everybody knows this. Henry Flagler, who builds a monumental hotel in St. Augustine, and what does he call it? The Ponce, the Juan Ponce de Leon. This is all about marketing youth, coming to Florida to be rejuvenated, to find youth. And so he builds the hotel, opens the hotel in the late 1880s, and then within 12 years, we get this. And this is a fabulous story. It really is I think, one of the great stories in the history of the United States, and surrounds a fascinating figure, Diamond Dill, or Llewellyn Day McConnell, who owned this piece of property. It's a magnificent piece of property in St. Augustine. How many of you have been to this place? Okay, and many of you have not. Well, she decided, walking her property one day, she encountered a spring. Never mind that the spring was not there in the 16th century. That spring was a function of 19th century dredging. It was not there in the 16th century. But she found the spring and she said, this is the Fountain of Youth. And what do you need to make it the Fountain of Youth? Well, you need a sign. You need to market it. Here's the Fountain of Youth. And all these people who are coming to St. Augustine to winter at this wonderful hotel, they need something to do. So they come to the park, drink the water, and the story builds from there. And it builds, and it builds, and it becomes, again, intimately associated with St. Augustine. I'm going to come back to this site in just a few moments, but I wanted to get back to what exactly does Ponce do? Why does he have so much fame if, in fact, the myth of the Fountain of Youth is the myth, or the discovery? We often hear that, well, Ponce discovered Florida. I love the image of Ponce arriving on the East Coast somewhere between Melbourne Beach, say, and Ponte Vedra, and arriving and meeting the local population, and the local population saying, thank you. Thank you for discovering us. We've been waiting to be discovered since that goofy land bridge flooded, and we've just been sitting, and you've done it. You are the discoverer of Florida. Well, what he does is he names Florida. The name Florida does not exist until Ponce. He names it. He names it after the Easter season on which that expedition first encountered land, and he names it Florida. But he's not the first European to set foot in what becomes the continental United States, not by any stretch. He's not the first Spaniard to set foot in the continental United States. This is a wonderful map. I'm going to show you just a couple of them. This is known as the Cantino Map. This is only part of the Cantino Map. It's a whole map of the world. And what you have here is Cuba, and here's Hispaniola, present-day Dominican Republic, and Haiti. And here you have some other islands in the Caribbean. What's this? it can't be Florida because Florida's not named. And of course, there's debate about this. Some suggest, no, this is an imagined coastline of East Asia, of China, because this map dates to 1502. So this is 11 years before Ponce sets sail, and we have something that looks strikingly similar to the Florida peninsula. Then in 1511, you have the Peter Martyr map, and here again, you have Cuba, Jamaica, Española. Here's the island of San Juan. Puerto Rico was the island was San Juan. San Juan, the city, was Puerto Rico. And here's San Juan and the Canaries. And then you have some text up here, and the text simply says, upside down, Isla de Bimini parte, part of the island of Bimini. And that was the perception at that time. The earliest known map that we have is a magnificent map that, again, I have to keep lobbying to get this in the textbooks because it really is the oldest confirmed map of any place in the continental United States. And this is a map that is known as the Lucci Map. Like so many of Florida's treasures, it does not reside in Florida. The original is in Florence, Italy. And again, here you have a map of the entire Atlantic. Here's North Africa, West Africa, the Iberian Peninsula, England and Scotland and Ireland and the Atlantic. And then once you cross, look at this outline. And this map dates, according to the Italians, to 1514 or 1515. This is a map clearly drawn by somebody who was either on that first Ponce de Leon expedition or spoke to someone who was on that first Ponce de Leon expedition. It too has names on it right here, upside down, Islas de Tortugas. Here are the Tortugas. This is a name that goes back to 1515. Up here on the very top, there's the letter I, and then a D-E, and then upside down, Florida. The island of Florida. And this map from 1514 or 1515 is the oldest known map with the name Florida on it. And of course, you have the Keys that the Spanish at the time referred to as Los Mártires. You get other maps of the Gulf. Here's Cuba. The map maker obviously didn't think much of South Florida, just chopped it off. And the text here simply says, this is Florida, which used to be called Bimini, which was discovered by Juan Ponce. And the top says, hasta aquí, until this point, descubrió Juan Ponce. Basically, what this map shows is a political jurisdiction of individual Spaniards who sought governorships in this Gulf of Mexico region. And this is what was seen as Ponce de Leon's governorship. Moving back to this Fountain of Youth site, one of the most remarkable aspects of the fact that it started in the early 20th century as a tourist attraction, it continues to be a tourist attraction, but unknown to Llewellyn de McConnell in the early 20th century and to the Fraser family when they purchased the property in the 1930s, it was not Ponce's landing spot, but it was the landing spot of St. Augustine's founder, Pedro Menendez de Avilés. And this is probably, in terms of St. Augustine real estate, one of the richest pieces of property you could own in St. Augustine. It's absolutely magnificent. And had they not done this, I promise you this would be the site of million-dollar condominiums or private homes, and we would have lost one of the most important archaeological sites, not just in the state, but in the country. Because this is exactly where Pedro Menendez de Avilés set up shop when he landed in Florida in 1565. That is the site, and across where the mission grounds and the Nombre de Dios mission site is, and the chapel of Our Lady of La Leche, that too was part of this early settlement. It is also the site of 3,000 years of uninterrupted human occupation. So it is a magnificent archaeological site, and I continue to marvel at the fact that there's some level of serendipity involved to create something as one thing and then learn that it's something entirely different. And the value of what's entirely different is so monumental. So Menendez then, why would a guy like this come? And I want to just very quickly run through some of the things that he had to do in his contract coming to Florida. And remember, he and the people who invested in Florida had to pay for this. He had to come with these 10 ships, load them with supplies, and prepare them for warfare. He and the investors had to pay for this. He had to bring 500 men, including 100 farmers, 100 sailors, and the rest men and officers of the sea, stonecutters, carpenters, farriers, blacksmiths, and surgeons. In other words, these are the people that we call the conquistadors. These are the skills that they had. He had to bring his magnificent ship, the San Pelayo. That's a different story. I've been following this ship for a number of years, and it's another amazing tale. He has to supply the men for 1 year. So everybody who joins, he has to pay to supply them for 1 year from the time they board the ships. He has to take 500 men. 200 of them have to be married. 100 farmers. They had to be religiously clean. Any idea what that meant? Well, at this time, of course, in Spain, they were concerned about suspected conversos, suspected Jewish settlers in the New World. Moors, obviously, they were worried about, and to some extent, Protestants as well. Menendez was much more pragmatic, and he took people from all categories, and just secretly, they arrived in Florida. He had to build or populate 3 towns, bring friars, calves, hogs, sheep, livestock. And of course, he was supposed to place 500 slaves in Florida. Well, he never comes close to doing this. He doesn't bring 500 slaves, but he gets the license for 500 slaves, which is like giving him cash. And he sells those licenses elsewhere in the Caribbean. He does not bring them to Florida. And then, of course, he has to leave a bond of 15,000 ducats. This was an enormous sum of money. If you think of a surgeon in St. Augustine at this time would make an annual salary of less than 100 ducats for the year. And he had to leave a bond of 15,000 ducats before he left, so the crown would make sure that he complied with this contract. And so you think, this sounds absurd. Why would somebody agree to pay for this, to go to a place that has a 50-year history of failure, of miserable expeditions, of people saying, don't even go there. It's an awful place. And Menendez says, oh, no, it'll be different. They have lovely beaches, and we can build something in St. Augustine. You think, why would he do this? Well, let's think about what he gets in return. Well, he gets 15,000 ducats. He gets the right to issue land grants and estates. He himself gets that right. And that was a major privilege. The 500 slave licenses. He gets the title of governor and captain general. He gets a guaranteed salary of 2,000 ducats per year, but he has to draw that from the fruits of the land. In other words, what's important, really important to understand here is that the crown doesn't pay for anything. The crown basically says, we give you promises. He gets this title of adelantado in perpetuity. So there is an adelantado of Florida who lives in Madrid. And so I can't wait until the next encounter with the governor. Who bows first, the adelantado or the governor? He gets 25 square leagues of land. This is about 110,000 acres in all of Las Provincias de la Florida. And Las Provincias de la Florida extended from the Tortugas to the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. That was what the Spanish thought of as the provinces of Florida. So next time you meet someone from Virginia or New England, just congratulate them for being an early Floridian, that they were Floridians before they were Virginians or New Englanders. He gets 2 fisheries in perpetuity. He gets a 1/15 share of royal profits in perpetuity. So the ancestor said, what are the chances of me showing up in Orlando and going to Disney with my contract to get my 1/5? I said, yeah, no, that probably won't happen. Tax exemptions, all kinds of concessions to build. What he wants to do is build a commercial fleet network with fish and ships and use Florida for that. And these are the people who are coming to Florida in the 16th century. Stone cutters, 21 tailors, shoemakers and hosiers, sheep shearers and blacksmiths, barbers and locksmiths and swordsmen, a hat maker, a trumpeter, and there were other musicians as well. And then I like this guy. I don't know, I hope I find him one day in the documents. Un maestre de hacer cerveza. A master beer brewer. Yeah, nobody's going to go on an expedition without a master beer brewer to prepare the beer. And this is what Menendez does in the first 3 years that he arrives in Florida. These are where he establishes garrisons. Here, 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 here. What in the world is he doing in Tennessee and North Carolina? And this is what he does those first 3 years. His vision, in a sense, is to control some ports, control the Atlantic seaboard. He wanted a settlement up at Chesapeake Bay. The people he sent up there got caught in a storm, so they sailed back to Spain instead. But he moves an expedition into Tennessee, and what his plan is to link a deep water port, or a series of deep water ports, principally this port at Santa Elena, a place we know today as Parris Island, South Carolina. If anyone's familiar with the Marine base on Parris Island, South Carolina. That's where this settlement of Santa Elena is located. And he wanted to establish a series of garrisons that connected that deep water port to a place in New Spain, or Mexico, called Zacatecas. Now, why Zacatecas? Well, Zacatecas was the site of the greatest silver mine in colonial Mexico. And what if that silver then can go overland to a deep water port and then straight back to Spain? Instead of going down Mexico to Veracruz, across to Havana, then up the very dangerous Florida Straits, Bahama Channel, where so many ships were going down, the risk of pirates. What happens if you're governor of all this territory and that silver gets to move through your governorship? In other words, this was a guy I think Donald Trump would have thought, yeah, he's a hero. He's establishing this entire network of business, commercial entities, and ships and shipbuilding, and that's what he envisioned Florida was going to be. What he didn't recognize very well is that it is a long way to northern Mexico from South Carolina. The other thing he didn't recognize really well is that there were already people living here. And those people were often far less enthusiastic about Menendez's plan than Menendez was about his plan. And a lot of the Spaniards and others who joined him did not like being isolated in small garrisons with 20 Spaniards in the middle of Tennessee. Before Nashville and honky-tonk, and there wasn't much to do, and they were constantly under threat of attack. So within a few years, all of these are gone. Gone, 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 gone. St. Augustine is still there. Gone, gone, gone. Santa Elena survives until 1587, and then it is consolidated at St. Augustine. So after 1587, St. Augustine is the only settlement, Spanish settlement, remaining in Florida. And it remains the only Spanish settlement until Pensacola in the late 17th century, even though there were missions established into the Panhandle after that. I know I'm almost out of time, so I just wanted to end on a couple of notes. One is, people often ask, why aren't more people doing this? Why aren't more people reading the 16th century documents? Well, part of it is reading the documents themselves, and this is a good example of it. This is something I show in the first day of the class that I teach students how to read this. First they come in and I make sure that they have comfy seats. Then I quietly move to the back where I lock the door. And then I show them this image. And the first time I saw this was a front page of a 17th century book of baptisms in St. Augustine. These documents go back to 1594. these records in St. Augustine. And this is one of the books from the 17th century. And some man, it had to have been a man, in his infinite wisdom, took a black marker on the original document and wrote the year 1640 question mark. The handwriting is actually 18th century. It's not 16th century, but the documents inside are 17th century. But the 18th century priest who wrote this, the reason it jumped out at me is I saw this word, and it's the word diablo, devil. And I thought, what is the word devil doing on the first book of the baptisms? And the text says the following: "My dear Lord, not even the devil could read this. The writing is so bad, I can't make out a single word in it." And so I tell my students, after the door's locked, for the next 8 months, you're going to learn how to read something the devil himself doesn't know how to read. And then they get a little excited. They say, okay, then I have some skills that the devil himself does not possess. But it is extremely challenging, and there's always some element of serendipity in finding these things. And if I could indulge you for just a couple of, how long, am I off? I'm okay? Okay. Well, in 2012, the Florida Humanities Council asked me to take a group of Floridians to Spain to show them sites that are related to Spanish Florida. So we went to Ponce de Leon's hometown of Santa Bas de Campos, total population 65. In peak season, 5 children, 3 of whom belong to the mayor, and we went to places that are related to the story of early Florida, and it was a great trip. But after the trip, the Humanities Council contacted me and said, you know, you have your debrief, and they said, is there anything you would do differently? We want you to do another one. I said, great. And they said, is there anything you do differently? I said, yeah, I'd like to go up to a little town called Tapia de Casariego, up in Asturias, in northern Spain. And there was silence on the other end. You know, why? And I said, well, one of my favorite governors. One day I'm going to write a book called 10 Dead Floridians I Wish I Could Have Taken to the Pub. And he is in that list of these Floridians from the 16th and early 17th century who has a fascinating story. And the story is really that when he left Florida, he was the governor of Florida from 1597 until 1603. And when he left, he packed 2 crates, boxes, filled with Florida corn seeds, maize seeds. And he took them back to northern Spain, and he planted them in northern Spain. And they harvested Florida corn in northern Spain. And I thought, I want to tell this story because it's such a great story. And they said, well, what is there to see? I said, I don't know, I've never been there. What is there to do? I have no idea. And they said, this sounds horrible. This sounds like the worst idea ever. I said, look, if the people who go on it complain, then you never have to ask me to do anything again. They said, oh, don't you worry. We will never ask you to do anything again. And so 2 weeks before we left on the trip, I wake up one morning and I have an email, and the name on the email is the same name as this governor. And so the hair on the back of my neck goes pa-ching, and I open the email, and it opens with, you don't know me, but, and I say, yeah, of course I know you. I'm the direct male descendant of Gonzalo Menendez de Cancio, Florida's 6th governor. And I screamed and frightened my wife, then she yelled at me, and I said, you won't believe this. In a couple of weeks, we're going to your ancestors' hometown. And he wrote back immediately, said, you won't believe this. I live an hour away. And I'll remember it as if it were yesterday. If there's anything I can do to help your group, please don't hesitate to ask. And so more correspondence followed, and he wrote one day, and he said, of course, you know that we still own the house where my ancestor was born. And this is it. This house here dates to 1542. This is the new part of it that's from the 18th century. Napoleon's forces actually occupied this house when Napoleon invaded Spain. It has an incredible history. But for me, this is where the corn was grown. And they still grow corn on this. It's not the same corn, it's GMO stuff. But that's where this is the same piece of property where they grew that corn. And we walked into the house, and he said, I have something I'd like to show you. This is one of the boxes that transported the Florida maize seeds. And I said, how do you know that that's one of the boxes? And he said, well, we can trace it in the family archive. You know, never mention family archives to historians. And then he said, come over here and I want to show you something else. This is the descendant. This table here, his ancestor also brought back from the Indies. It might be from Florida. We don't know. If this table is from Florida, this is the oldest piece of European furniture, surviving European furniture from any part of the continental United States in his house. And I opened the documents. He brought some original documents with him. And one of the documents was actually written in English. And I read the signature, and it was signed by an Englishman named Francis Drake. About 6 months before Drake died. It might be one of the last letters that Drake signed. And so, you know, I'm trying to look cool here, but it's not working. And of course, just to end, Florida's 6th governor is buried here. And it hadn't been opened he said it hadn't been opened in 30 years, and 2 years ago, after we'd been working together quite a bit, he said, I want you to come into the chapel. I think it's time we open the doors after 30 years. So we had to break in. Everything had rusted shut, and we had to break in, and this is what it looks like inside. So maybe one day we'll restore it. It would be magnificent if we had a trail to visit where Florida's 6th governor is buried, and this is his tombstone. So on that note, I know I am over. I'm stopping. Thank you so much for coming. And